woman who stayed at the riot scene in Dixmoor, Illinois, August 17, 1964, is carried to a police van. Police had ordered all persons indoors in the race riot area. Those who didn't were taken into custody in Dixmoor, a Chicago suburb. More than 12 were arrested. A number of large cities across the eastern U.S. experienced race-related riots during the summer of 1964. Following World War II, pressures to recognize, challenge, and change inequalities for minorities grew. One of the most notable challenges to the status quo was the 1954 landmark Supreme Court case Brown v. In this January 18, 1964 photo, U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson, right, talks with civil rights leaders in his White House office in Washington. The black leaders, from left, are Roy Wilkins, Executive Secretary of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP; James Farmer, National Director of the Committee on Racial Equality; Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference; and Whitney Young, Executive Director of the Urban League. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, which questioned the notion of separate but equal in public education. The court found that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal and a violation of the 14th Amendment. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gives a young protester a pat on the back as a group of youngsters started to picket St. Augustine, Florida, on June 10, 1964. This decision polarized Americans, fostered debate, and served as a catalyst to encourage federal action to protect civil rights each year. From 1945 until 1957, Congress considered and failed to pass a civil rights bill. Several Ku Klux Klan members, most in white robes and unmasked hoods, carry placards stating, "Please stay out, blacks and whites mix here." Congress finally passed limited civil rights acts in 1957 and 1960, but they offered only moderate gains. As a result of the 1957 Act, the United States Commission on Civil Rights was formed to investigate, report on, and make recommendations to the president concerning civil rights issues. Ivory Ward, 43, sits in his car with a hole in his windshield that he said was made by a bullet fired from a truck driven by white men after African Americans marched in an integration demonstration, June 10, 1964, in St. Augustine, Florida. Sit-ins, boycotts, freedom rides, the founding of organizations such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, local demands for inclusion in the political process, all were in response to the increase in legislative activity through the 1950s and early 1960s. 1963 was a crucial year for the civil rights movement. Integration demonstrators, after a long march through the white business and residential section of St. Augustine, Florida, held prayer sessions at the Monson Motor Lodge restaurant on June 18, 1964. The restaurant has been the target of many sit-in attempts by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Social pressures continued to build with events such as the Birmingham Campaign, televised clashes between peaceful protesters and authorities, the murders of civil rights workers Medgar Evers and William V. Moore, the March on Washington, and the deaths of 4 young girls in the bombing of Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church. A Toddle House restaurant in Atlanta, Georgia, occupied during a sit-in. In the room are Taylor Washington, Ivanhoe Donaldson, Joyce Ladner, John Lewis behind Judy Richardson, George Green, and Chico Neblett. There was no turning back. Civil rights were firmly on the national agenda, and the federal government was forced to respond. An unidentified African American demonstrator crouches for protection against blows from white man in front of segregated Nashville restaurant on May 1, 1964. 3 or 4 African Americans were hurt in a series of scuffles between demonstrators and white men and white youths. In response to the report of the United States Commission on Civil Rights, President John F. Kennedy proposed, in a nationally televised address, a Civil Rights Act of 1963. Civil rights marchers walked through the streets of downtown Cambridge, Maryland, on May 12, 1964. The National Guard were deployed to keep order after a violent confrontation the night before. A week after his speech, Kennedy submitted a bill to Congress addressing civil rights. He urged African American leaders to use caution when demonstrating since new violence might alarm potential supporters. National Guard troops with upthrust bayonets surround integrationists kneeling in prayer as approximately 100 made a peaceful attempt to challenge the no demonstration edict of the military commander in Cambridge, Maryland on May 13, 1964. Kennedy met with businessmen, religious leaders, labor officials, and other groups such as CORE and NAACP, while also maneuvering behind the scenes to build bipartisan support and negotiate compromises over controversial topics following Kennedy's assassination in November 1963, both Martin Luther King Jr. A police officer carrying a young girl walks past 3 civil rights demonstrators on the ground next to the Tulsa, Oklahoma, police station on April 2, 1964. The demonstrators were part of 54 arrested at a Tulsa restaurant. Members of the group, backed by the Congress of Racial Equality, went limp when arrested and forced officers to carry them from the restaurant and the paddy wagon. And newly inaugurated President Lyndon B. Johnson continued to press for passage of the bill, as King noted in a January 1964 newspaper column. Legislation will field the intense focus of black interest. It became the order of the day at the Great March on Washington last summer. J.B. Stoner, segregationist from Atlanta, Georgia, holds a Confederate flag as he addresses a large crowd of whites at a slave market in St. Augustine, Florida, on June 13, 1964, and then leads them on a long march through an African American residential section. At right is signed, "The Tread Kill Civil Rights Bill." The black and his white compatriots for self-respect and human dignity will not be denied. The House of Representatives debated civil rights bill for 9 days, rejecting nearly 100 amendments designed to weaken the bill. Andrew Young leans into a police car to talk to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the back seat with a police dog as he is returned to jail in St. Augustine, Florida, after testifying before a grand jury investigating racial unrest in the city on June 12, 1964. It passed the House on February 10, 1964 after 70 days of public hearings, appearances by 275 witnesses, and 5,792 pages of published testimony. The real battle was waiting in the Senate, however, where concerns focused on the bill's expansion of federal powers and its potential to anger constituents who might retaliate in the voting booth. New York City policemen tangle with demonstrators at a subway station on the opening day of the New York World's Fair, April 22, 1964. Youths attempted to stall the train, which was headed from the city to the fairgrounds, as a form of protest on behalf of civil rights for blacks. Opponents launched the longest filibuster in American history, which lasted 57 days. And brought the Senate to a virtual standstill. Senate Minority Leader Everett Dirksen nurtured the bill through compromise discussions and ended the filibuster. When a group of white and black integrationists refused to leave a motel swimming pool in St. Augustine, Florida, this man dove in and cleared them out on June 18, 1964. All were arrested. Dirkson's compromise bill passed the Senate after 83 days of debate that filled 3,000 pages in the congressional record. The House moved quickly to approve the Senate bill. When a group of white and African American integrationists entered a segregated hotel swimming pool, manager James Brock poured acid into it, shouting, "I'm cleaning the pool," in St. Augustine, Florida, on June 18, 1964. Read more about this picture. Within hours of its passage on July 2, 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson, with Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in St. Augustine, Florida, reacts after learning that the U.S. Senate passed the Civil Rights Bill on June 19, 1964. Dorothy Height, Roy Wilkins, John Lewis, and other civil rights leaders in attendance signed the bill into law, declaring once and for all that discrimination for any reason on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin was illegal in the United States of America. Sit-in protests were held in cafes, restaurants and hotels, opposing discriminatory service and hiring practices. The public swimming pool has been changed into a private pool in order to remain segregated in Cairo, Illinois. Small-town all-white schools were required to integrate, and big city schools began large-scale efforts to integrate. Bus segregationists, angered by the Civil Rights Act, took to the streets as well, often attacking African American demonstrations across the South. New York firemen, backed up by police, turned fire hoses on rioters in Rochester, New York, on July 25, 1964, in an effort to quell street disturbance. Set off by reports of police brutality during an arrest on July 24, the Rochester riot lasted several days. Decades of police brutality, capped off by several incidents in the summer of 1964, led to a series of racially motivated riots in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, and Jersey City. The year ended hopefully, though, as activist Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. A police officer falls to pavement as he struggles to apprehend a man in Rochester, New York, July 25, 1964. Was presented with the Nobel Peace Prize for his ongoing efforts to promote peaceful change amid harsh opposition and threats of violence. Several Ku Klux Klan members, most in white robes and unmasked hoods, carry placards stating, "Please stay out, blacks and whites mix here." This is the beginning of a clash between African Americans and police officers in Rochester, New York, July 27, 1964. Fire hoses turned on house's porch. A woman stands her ground as companions duck behind porch's wall. When a group of white and African American integrationists entered a segregated hotel swimming pool, manager James Brock poured acid into it, shouting, "I'm cleaning the pool," in St. Augustine, Florida, on June 18, 1964. Police lead a man away during clash in Rochester, New York, on July 27, 1964. Read more about this picture. Photo credit, AP Photo. On June 29, 1964, the FBI began distributing these pictures of three missing civil rights workers. From left, Michael Schwerner, 24, of New York, James Chaney, 21, from Mississippi, and Andrew Goodman, 20, of New York, who disappeared near Philadelphia, Mississippi, on June 21, 1964. The three civil rights workers, part of the Freedom Summer program, were abducted, killed and buried by KKK members in an earthen dam in rural Neshoba County.